got the Student's Guide to Lost Learning for November and December assessments. So I'm just going to talk you through how to use this guide. There's an introduction at the beginning, and this really outlines that this has been put in place because of the ongoing stresses and strains we've got through the COVID-19 pandemic, and how learning's been interrupted, and there's different levels of lost learning that are happening across the globe. So our regulator Ofqual has given us some guidelines around this, and we are able to give you a little bit more guidance on areas to focus on for assessment windows. And the reason for that is mainly due to the fact that you may not have had much face-to-face contact time or remote delivery time as you would have had, and you may have had to do a lot more self-study during this period. So this guide is really to give you an idea of how you can focus your research for your open book exams and your assignments. One thing I do want to say, though, it's advisable that you study the whole syllabus for the unit that you're taking an assessment in. So if you can, study the whole syllabus, and then as you start to work through your assignment, you can use this guide to really pinpoint the individual assessment criteria that you're going to need to expand on in a little bit more detail. So it clearly states there that this is just for this assessment window. Don't muddle this one up with the May-June one. And you also need the relevant ABE syllabi unit resource, and the study guide is useful as well for this. Okay, so you'll see that as we go through, it's in unit level order. There's only one level 3 unit. And what you'll see here is it will list the question numbers, the syllabus criteria number, and then the individual assessment criteria. For level 3, it's set out slightly differently to the other levels, and you'll see marks per question. Okay, so looking at this one, it's clear that question 1 has got 35 marks, so it's going to require a bigger answer and more detail. And you can also see that more assessment criteria are covered with question 1. So that's how you'll need to sort of focus your research, looking at the breakdown of the marks allocated to each of the questions. So as I said, the level 3 unit is slightly different to the others. It goes in order. We've got all of the level 4 units, then all of the level 5, then all of the level 6. So if we just take an example of a level 4 unit here, you'll see the question numbers are listed down the side. Each question will be in order of the learning outcomes. And then what we've done is we've broken down the specific assessment criteria that the question really relates to. Now, for this question, there's 16 marks, and the main focus is assessment criteria 1.4. Having said that, you do need to look at all of the assessment criteria in learning outcome 1, because there might be some interrelated criteria that might get you larger, get you higher marks. So focus on 1.4, make sure you understand that, but look at the learning outcome as a whole as well. And really this guide just follows that format all the way through. It gives you an idea for each unit, the question numbers, and the marks that are allocated to those question numbers. You'll see for some that they're broken down into an A and B, so 3 part A, 3 part B. And again, you'll see there that the marks are split, and they're split over different assessment criteria as well. So use this guide in conjunction with your assignment writing or your open book exam writing to give you a bit more of a guide as to really where to focus your reading. That said, you do, if you want to hit the upper ends of the marks, as Simon are going into a bit more detail further on in this session, you do need to do some wider reading and some wider research as well. But hopefully this will just give you a bit of reassurance if you're struggling with self-study, that it gives you a little bit more support around where the questions will be focused. I'm just going to briefly stop sharing and go back to the slides. Simon, if you can confirm again for me that you can see these, that would be good. Otherwise, I'll be carrying on talking. And
yes, I can see these.
Perfect. I'm going to try and get the slide show up if this little banner will disappear at the bottom for me. One moment. God, everything's in the way today. Here we go. Okay, so we're back to the agenda. So we've looked at the Student Guide to Lost Learning Time. And as I said before, the centre guidance document is very similar to this. And it'll give centres an idea of how to support students. Exactly the same detail in there. Okay, so we've covered that one off, the lost learning time. Now we're going to go back to some basics. Previously, we've run sessions with our academic team, and Carrie Foster, one of our academic team, has delivered a really, really nice long session around writing a great assignment, which can still be viewed on YouTube. And there's links at the end of these slides to remind you of where that is. What we've done is we've taken some snippets from that, and we're going to go through and give you a little bit of a reminder on how best to prepare for your up and coming assessments and some top tips around that. Okay, so first of all, with an assignment and an open book exam, there's always an organisational summary that's required. So with the organisational summary, there's some key things that you can see on this slide that need to be included. So typical things like the name of the org, the size, the main markets they operate in, examples of what they do, so their products and services, etc., that you can see there. The key thing with it, though, is that you have a look at the questions first that are in your assessment. And then if you look at the questions that are in the assignment or the open book exam, you can then decide what sort of organisation would best serve you answering those questions. For some questions, it would be better to have a larger organisation, maybe a more global organisation. For other questions, a local organisation would be good enough. There are some units where an organisation that's maybe very small might not help you fully answer the questions in the detail required. So think about your organisational summary in relation to the questions that you're being asked in the unit and in relation to the particular unit. It could be you're doing 2 or 3 units and you pick an organisation and it actually works for all 3. That's completely fine. There's no problem with that, but do make sure you read the questions and make sure the organisation is relevant to answer those questions and give you a good chance at answering those questions. Now, we say it needs to be about 200 words long, but it's not included in your word count, but we do need some detail about your organisational summary. Now, as you'll see right at the top, if you fail to include it, you will get a 0 mark, and that means you will fail the unit. The reason for that is ABE's qualifications are designed to be applied. So although they're very, very knowledge-based, what we want to do during the assessment is to be able to apply that knowledge. So we want to see that you're taking the knowledge and you're able to apply it. Let's see if I can mute everybody. Okay, Simon or Linda, could I just ask you to have a look to see if you can mute everybody, please, because somebody's come in and they're not automatically muted as they should be, so I can continue doing the delivery. Okay, so a 0 mark would mean that you've actually failed the unit. So do make sure that you include that and make sure you check that back for its relevance. Okay. One moment, sorry, a few technical hitches today, it would seem. Okay, somebody is still not on mute. Could I ask everybody to mute, please, if they've just come into the meeting? Okay. Okay, so now we're going to move on to word count and appendices. You'll see that we've circled here, and it's a snapshot of what a typical assignment or an open book exam would look like. And it shows the word count. We've highlighted there that there's a 10% tolerance either way. So you can either do under the word count by 10% or over the word count by 10%. Any more than that, and the marker will stop marking. So you may feel that you want to write lots and lots and lots to show your knowledge. The key thing with open book exams and assignments is that you can write in a detailed and concise way. So we don't want lots and lots of words. We just want you to meet the word count in answering the questions. References and appendices are not included. However, don't add lots and lots of appendices in, and then in the main body of your text say, see Appendix 1, see Appendix 2, see Appendix 3, because the marker won't go through, that will only look at relevant references to appendices. And from next year onwards, we're going to be stopping the use of appendices. So I would say for this window, if you can, do without appendices. Just reference things directly in the text if they're relevant to answering the question, rather than adding in lots and lots and lots of appendices that really aren't referenced correctly or relevant to the answer of the question. So the key thing is you stick to the word count, and that you answer the questions that are in front of you. In terms of allocation of word count, you'll be able to see this by the marks that are given for each question. So as the example shows there, if it's a 10-mark question, then you'll know how that you only use 10 marks worth of words. For the open book exams, we do give you a word count as a guide. For the assignments, there's task 1 to 4 normally, and we don't give you a word count breakdown across those tasks. So for the assignments, have a look at the marks that are allocated, and then work out your percentage word count in accordance to those marks that are allocated. The more marks the task gives, the more words that you can give for that task. The other pointer is, if you can start by typing your assignments or your open book exams in Word, you can then use the word count function. And then when you're happy that you've got your final submission, you can save it as a PDF and then submit it. And you'll know that you've checked those words. Our markers will stop marking if something goes over the word count. And generally speaking, on sort of 12 font, 10 or 12 font, they have a good idea of how many pages that is. So don't feel that because it's a PDF that you can just keep writing and writing and the markers will mark it. They'll stop marking. And that could be the difference between a pass and a refer. So take real good note of your word count and the marks that are allocated for each question. Okay. This may sound really obvious, this next point, but you need to read the question and follow the instructions. There's command words at the beginning of every question. So it could say, explain X and Y. It could ask you to describe something. It could ask you to evaluate something. As you get up through the levels, sort of 5 and 6, you might see things like critically analyze or critically assess. And so you need to take note of that command word that's given at the beginning of the question, because that'll indicate how you answer the question. So what you need to really avoid, and a slide further on we'll talk about this, is just taking all the theory that you know and dumping it in the answer of your question. You need to structure your question and you need to follow the instructions that are in the questions. So it's really important you look at the command words at the beginning and respond and answer to that. Also, there's another example. In some questions, it asks you to talk about your skills in relation to something. So a lot of the HR-based units will talk about, you know, what skills do you bring to your organisation? And so you need to then talk about your skills and not just skills in general that would be good for that particular job role. Some things do require slides to be to be added with them, or project plans. And so just make sure you read the instructions. If it says 8 slides, don't deliver 12 or 14 or 5, deliver no more than 8 slides. Okay, and just stay within the framework, because you don't get marked for things that you're not asked for. So you might think, oh, this could relate to the question, and I'll add these 20 appendices in. They won't get looked at if they're not relevant. And as I said, from next year, we'll be dropping the appendices. So it's a good habit to try not to include them now. Okay, so this application of context is really important. You'll pick an organisation, as I said at the beginning, but if you look at the questions before you pick that organisation, you'll get the best chance at applying your knowledge to that example of your organisation. So you would look at the theory that you need to look at around each question, and then you think about your organisation and give examples of when answering the question of how it's relevant to that particular organisation. By applying context, that's where you pick up more marks, because the qualifications, as we said, are about not only you understanding business theory, but also showing that you've got a level of application by picking an organisation and applying your answers to that organisation. So it's really important that happens, and that you show that in your answer. I've briefly mentioned theory dumping. What we mean by theory dumping is that you might read up, say, Learning Outcome 1 in the study guide, and there's a whole load of theories in there, and you've got them in your head, and then a question asked you about potentially evaluating the importance of X theory within your organisation. And what you then proceed to do is just tell us all about the theory. So look at the question. We're not asking you to tell us and repeat the theory. We're asking you to evaluate the usefulness of a theory. So really, really look at the question and avoid just telling us what you know about a theory. So the question asked you to, describe or explain X theory, then of course you have to describe or explain X theory. But most of the questions talk about, is a theory relevant to and used in your organisation? So it's about talking about how it's used. So we don't need you to tell us in that instance all about the theory. We just need you to tell us about how you apply it and how it's used. So again, it's about looking at the question and looking at the words in the question, so the command words and the detail of the question, to ensure that you answer it correctly, and don't just say, see the 14 principles of management and start telling us about them unless we've asked you, describe the 14 principles of management. If we haven't said that, then don't think you need to describe it to answer the question. It's about you understanding the theory and then applying it to answer the question. Okay, so there's some top tips, and they're things that every window our markers see happening, and just want us to remind students not to fall into that trap unless obviously the question specifically asks them to explain or describe a theory. Okay, we've talked about this quite a bit already, so taking notice of the command words. So I will share these slides with centres, and they will get shared after this session. And there's some links to our command word documents. These are all on the website as well and can be found on the portal. But this is really worth keeping open when you're putting your assignments or your open book exams together. It's a really good idea to have this document to hand, because as you get the question, you can go back into this document and think, do I understand that command word? So if the command word is evaluate, what's the expectation? What type of answer would I be giving? What's expected? What does that mean? And this document really guides you and gives you some examples to how questions should be answered with the use of different command words. So it's a really, really useful document, and one that we say you should use every time you're starting to write up your assignments or your open book exams. Okay, at this point, I'm going to be quiet, and I'm going to hand over to Simon. And Simon, if you just want to say next slide when you're ready, I will flick you on to the next slide.
Thank you, Vicky. Can you hear me? So I'm going to spend a little bit of time, the next few slides, talking about some very important things, particularly how to increase your grade level and what makes a good academic argument, followed by some tips for reading and for evidence gathering. And then later on, we're going to be talking about my favorite subject, which is academic malpractice. So starting off with tips on increasing your grade level. Vicky, yes, moving on to the next slide. So in each of the syllabuses that we publish, you'll find some what we call grade descriptors in the back of each unit description, and but here we thought we would give a sort of a hierarchy of potential grades by looking at content and evaluating particular types of content within within answers that we get. So starting off with a very poor answer might be, and this is looking at answering a question about COVID-19, the coronavirus, and examining ways in which reasons why the virus expanded exponentially around the world. So something which is very descriptive and rather poor in terms of answer is just to say, well, there was a virus. Which, yes, we know, I think would be a marker's reaction, that's a very basic statement and is not likely to gain much in the way of marks. More in terms of description, but being very descriptive, is to say, well, there was a pandemic caused by a virus, many people got ill and died prematurely. That is certainly a description of what's happened, but doesn't really give much information about cause and effect, or any point to any wider implications of the virus. Some evaluation, which will gain sort of at the upper end of the pass mark, remembering that pass is at 40 and a merit mark starts at 55, is a global pandemic caused by a virus called COVID-19. Many people got sick and died prematurely, and a description of government agencies and NGOs, non-governmental organisations, and their reactions to it. There is some evaluation, but it could go a lot further. Getting the higher end of the marks now, so we're out of a higher pass and into a merit. We perhaps talk about things contextually. So here, the risk of a global pandemic caused by a coronavirus was predicted. It's not as though coronavirus of itself is something that hasn't erupted before globally. Those with longer memories may remember the SARS outbreak in 2001, for example. It's all part of the same cluster of virus families. So the risk of a global pandemic caused by a coronavirus was predicted. It's not something that just comes out of nowhere. So the 2020 pandemic was caused by COVID-19 virus, which is highly infectious. You can talk about the R rate, so where it is above 1, it becomes infections almost exponential, and then analyze some of the reactions to this event. This is becoming more evaluative and shows a grasp of the wider context, the history, and ways in which public disasters of this kind can be predicted. Getting towards higher marks still, so 70% is a distinction in our mark scheme. A dynamic global economy and high transmission rates cause the rapid spread of a highly infectious disease. So this again is probing into the reasons as to why this particular disease became evidential throughout the world. So you are actually looking at something which is, if you like, a function of a global economy. Many of the infection rates in Europe, for example, Italy became and Belgium became two of the countries where infection rates grew the quickest through international travel as much as anything else. And then that which is going to get you higher marks still is to again probe the causes and the consequences, and actually to make an evaluation of some of the solutions. So here in this example, we're positing that the battle against coronavirus is not going to be solved by the development of vaccines. Vaccines is not going to make this disease disappear. That there are actually wider implications. For example, tackling poverty, funding health services, preventative measures, these sorts of things. So we're looking at something which is original and contains a measure of critical analysis. Again, think about the command words that Vicky was talking about earlier. And particularly at the higher diploma levels, level 5 and level 6. We know in Sri Lanka that most of the centres are doing level 5 and level 6 diplomas, that the critically analyse is going to be one of the key command words that you will find in some of the questions that are asked in the assignments and the OBEs. So that gives a sort of a framework of how mark distribution is generated on the basis of the sophistication of the answers that are given by learners in assignments and OBEs. Next slide, please, Vicky. Seems we've encountered the odd technical problem. Aha. So, gathering evidence. That's the next task. So, on to slide 15. So, the next one. Excellent, thank you. So we've in this slide we've summarised, if you like, a hierarchy of sources and divided the slide into two columns, one on the left-hand side and one on the right-hand side, to give learners a guide really of which types of sources to concentrate on and which to not exactly avoid necessarily, but which to treat with a degree of skepticism. So we start first of all with the ABE study guide. There's one for each unit. The study guides contain a wealth of information about the theories, the bibliographies that are used in the construction of the units, and should be used as a springboard for debate, for analysing the debates about particular subjects. So start with those, and then move out to other sources, particularly those which are what we call the academic journals. So whether it's their sourced from open source, Google Scholar, various other, or whether from the journal websites, and so, because each of those journals has got websites. Industry magazines, so industry sources which are published by participants within specific industries. Published research reports, particularly those from NGOs, the non-government organisations like the OECD, the World Bank, UNESCO, various other organisations which invest a lot in producing country reports, industry reports, and so forth. If you are looking at a particular organisation, then your organisation will also publish, particularly if they're quoted companies, then they publish annual reports and accounts for investors. Usually most joint stock companies, even private limited companies, have to submit report and accounts annually to fulfill public information requirements and so forth, and that's pretty standard in most countries around the world. And then you have the textbooks and the academic books which are used in classrooms which are focused on a particular topic or subject. Ones to perhaps put on the more skeptical list are those which are, if you like, published from online sources. We have our favorite, which is Wikipedia. On one level, there's nothing wrong with Wikipedia, but do remember that Wikipedia is can be manipulated by special interest groups. Very often you get Wikipedia scams where famous people, particularly when they die, people go in and edit those persons, people's profiles, and put in ludicrous statements, which it takes moderators some time to remove. So the statements that are made by Wikipedia are sometimes have to be treated with a degree of skepticism. And also publications by other online organizations. Facebook, for example, is a good one of this. Be skeptical or wary of materials that are out of date. Research articles without sources, so it's very difficult to know what the basis is of the assertions or the findings or the conclusions that are in a report with no sources. Other websites and personal opinions not backed up by hard data, I think is going to be on that right-hand list. Next slide, please, Vicky. So think about how reliable your source is. So think about what the qualifications are of the author. Are they practicing academics? Are they professors? Are they industry experts? Have they been in the business for 10, 20, 30 years? That's going to lend a degree of reassurance based on qualifications. Are the sources listed? Does it have a reference list or the bibliography at the back? And have a look at the types of articles and books that and references that are being cited to give an idea of the spread of information that the author has used. Is the article or journal, is it peer reviewed? So the mainstay academic reviews, say like the Harvard Business Review, those articles are what we call peer reviewed. So after submission, it will be sent by editors to readers who will make comments which are relayed back to the author. So it's a way of giving a kite mark, as it were, to work which is going to be put into the public domain. Is the writing objective? Does the writer have a particular agenda which is not supported by the evidence? Is it a series of assertions rather than a series of conclusions drawn from evidence? What's the purpose of the source? So again, you have to look at the source and think, see whether the sources are balanced, and think about when it was published. We did say in the previous slide to be wary of sources where it's sort of out of date, as it were, you might say in inverted commas, but some seminal texts and some management tools have actually been around for a very long time. It's worth remembering that the father of economics, Adam Smith, was a man who died in the 18th century, and yet his Wealth of Nations, and particular his analysis of the division of labour, is still one of the seminal economic texts that is used even to this day. We did a presentation to Malawi yesterday where we were noting that in project management, one of the key project management tools is something called a Gantt chart. Andrew Gantt was an American sociologist, and he invented this particular management tool in 1911, so 110 years ago. So it's the age and the provenance of management tools and academic writing is not necessarily disqualified by age, but it's worth remembering that the context and the techniques that have evolved over the last 10, 20 years will change the applicability of some conclusions and some data. For example, Hofstede's analysis of the of cultural aspects of organizational change, was written as a critique of the IBM studies taking place in the 1960s. So, which is actually still, because of the wealth of the data that was used and generated, something in the region of 250,000 data points from specific individuals around, I think, 7 different IBM territories. You know, it's still a source which is mined, but you know, the attitudes and the presumptions surrounding that data set, obviously, because it was done in the 60s, has changed immeasurably. Next, yes. So again, reading for evidence. I think one of the key things that you know, that you need to focus on, or learners can focus on, is where you will find sources of evidence quickly. And when you're writing a critique of particular texts or theories, then, as Vicky says, don't describe necessarily what the theory says, but focus on those aspects of the of a theory or framework which are likely to be illuminating, as to use it as a framework for analysis of the data that's been supported, which is supporting and coming from your chosen organisation. So again, interrogate the sources and say, you know, what's the main purpose of the study? What's the goal that the academic has set in order to discover the conclusions? What key questions is the author addressing? What is the most important information? What's the data source? What are the main inferences and conclusions, and are they supported by the evidence that has been adduced? And if we take line of reasoning series, what seriously, then what are the implications? What consequences are likely to follow if people take the author's reasoning and apply them in a variety of situations? So be alert to, if you like, the context of theory or academic journals, and also be aware of the motivation of the writers and what they are, what they're intending to show, and then have a think about whether or not the evidence that the writer has produced does actually support the arguments that are being placed upon them. Next slide, please. Now, this is a key one, and it relates to, and it goes into slides which we'll be looking at a little bit further down, which relate to academic malpractice. One of the key things I think that learners should try to avoid is simply, particularly in using online sources, of just doing a sort of a copy and paste. You see a nice little summary online on a website, and you think, oh yes, that summarizes everything about XYZ theory, and it really answers the question that has been posed in my assignment or the OBE, and you copy and paste it, and it looks very neat and tidy. However, all that demonstrates is your ability to be able to manipulate an internet source and put it into a document. So don't quote, don't whole-scale copy, synthesize. Show that you have some understanding. You have an understanding of the theory, and particularly the frameworks and how they relate to the company that you have chosen, so that you can demonstrate that it's your work. Support the work with statement by incorporating ideas of your own, by saying, yes, this theoretician says this, but on the other hand, if you look at my company, this doesn't necessarily apply. So it shows that you're alert to the insights that a theory might provide, but on the other hand, you're showing that the data evidence that you can bring to bear on the question actually shows it up in a different, the theory up in a different light. So, and that's come through your understanding and your and also the wider reading. So synthesis is really important as a feature of academic writing. Next slide, please. Okay, so this segues very nicely into avoiding academic malpractice. Academic malpractice consists basically of three things. So one is plagiarism. The second is collusion, and we'll come on to that. And then there's what in our language we talk about as poor academic practice, but we'll look at each one of these in turn. So don't copy somebody else's work. So, yep, stay on that slide, thank you. Make sure you correctly cite and reference the sources in the work. And when in doubt, there comes a point where, if you're discussing a theory in each point to give a reference, to every line, to every page may seem a little bit like overkill, but there are times, every time you make an assertion, that something applies, then make sure that you've got evidence, particularly if it comes from somebody else's work, to make sure that it's properly referenced. Because what we want to read is your voice, not the voice of other people's. You can create a perfectly workable assignment on the basis of other people's work, and that's not really the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise is to show that you have a reference view on how to answer a particular question that takes into account evidence that you have created and collated, and that you can demonstrate your understanding of how the theory can act as a framework to illuminate that, to analyze the data that you've created. So in terms of the referencing, we adopt the Harvard reference system. There is a link on, I think, in this presentation to how we reference, and particularly here. So you give the author's surname and the date and the page numbers and the publication location if that's listed. Next slide. So collusion is where two or more people get together to either share a common framework for answering a question, but more specifically, usually by taking the work of a third party and passing it off as their own. So we see many examples of this from two or more learners with answering a particular unit assignment or OBE, where it's quite clear that they've identified a single source, and they both copied from it almost word for word, thinking that they can disguise this by changing the company name and through the company summary, unfortunately leaving everything else intact, just changing the company name as they go through in a search and replace function. Unfortunately, we use Turnitin, a plagiarism software, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which identifies this, not only that two or more learners have copied off a common source, but if that common source is another ABE student, it will identify that ABE student as well. So do take care not to collude, because this actually will be you'll be found out much quicker than with the plagiarism example that we talked about earlier. So make sure that you keep the integrity of your work intact. So don't let others read your work. Don't give, and particularly don't sell someone your answer if you've already done it and got a high score, and don't do the work for somebody else. Next slide. Yeah, and then there's this one, which is poor academic practice. When we use Turnitin, we have for each level a set of criteria by which we judge a piece of work. It's also worth noting, and I'll reinforce this, that you may well present, if you're a learner, present your work in good faith, having no intention to cheat, but have just been careless. Unfortunately, if you have, as I said earlier, taken whole-scale blocks of text from particular internet sources, many of which incidentally are actually designed precisely for this purpose, without either A, attribution, or B, changing very much of it, you will get what they call a very high match score percentage. And the higher the match score percentage in plagiarism cases, the greater at risk you are of your work being deemed as being plagiarist, whether you had that intention or not. So we work from the basis that if you have a high match score, your carelessness is not an excuse. So those pieces of work which are at the borderline of the Turnitin levels at each stage, at each level, may fall into what we call the poor academic practice. So if they're on the cusp, if the top 5 sources account for more than 60–70% of the total match score up to the allowable amount, then it is very probable that your work will be deemed poor academic practice, particularly if it's poorly referenced, and will be capped at a pass for the unit, which is 40, even though academically it may be assessed at a higher level. So you run the risk of having the work capped as a fail at a pass, if you see what I mean. That's how we classify that. So do what you can in order to avoid that. So thank you for listening. I will now hand over back to Vicky.
Thanks, Simon. Okay, so that's kind of the overview or the reminder, if you like, on how to prepare for your assignments and your open book exams. We're just going to summarise what we've been through and highlight the key points from that session. And we haven't mentioned yet the ABE way, but I think everything that Simon and I have been talking about is born out of a set of principles that we follow at ABE. And the ABE way is something that's been developed because of our students and our centres and the way that, generally speaking, students and centres conduct themselves. And one of the key principles is acting with integrity. So I think everything that we've tried to do today in this session is to help students and centres embed integrity into everything that they do. So Simon's advice then around academic malpractice is really just to highlight to students and centres how easy it is to fall into that and not necessarily knowingly fall into it. So hopefully that guidance that Simon's given will help everybody sort of achieve their goals and act with integrity along the way, and be part of the ABE community in the way that we do things in order to achieve your overall goal of your qualifications. So that's one reminder. Answering the questions and responding to command words, I think, is one of the key things that we've said during this session. A question came in on Facebook to say, but shouldn't we just give a definition of a theory as a kind of pre-run to answering a question? And my answer to that would be, unless you've been asked to explain or describe a particular theory, if you're asked to refer to, say, Porter's 5 forces in an answer, look at the command word of how it's asking you to respond to that. So is the application of that theory useful in the context of your given organisation? You wouldn't then need to give a definition of the theory before you answered the question, because it's asking you, is that theory relevant to your organisation, or how is it used, maybe? So you wouldn't have to describe the theory then say how it's used. It's asking you to talk about the relevance of it in relation to the organisation. So look at the command word, and that will determine whether or not a description or a definition is required. But I'd say for level 5 and above, it probably wouldn't be a command word that would be. And then you'd also need to look at the explain and describe and the rest of the question to determine whether or not a definition is required. Most of the time it isn't. Our academic team are marking these. They know the theories. They don't need a reminder of a theory, unless the question is outline the such and such theory. or explain it, then yeah, a definition of it, an explanation of it would be completely fine. Keep to the point and avoid waffling. So if you're not too sure when you're answering a question, it's open book. So go back and do a bit more research. For this session, you've got the Guide to Lost Learning. So you've got a little bit more detail around the specific assessment criteria that should help you determine where you do that particular research. Right at the very beginning, we talked about word count and sticking with a word count. So if you can, write your assignments in a Word document, check the word count. Then when you're happy, you've got your final submission, save it as a PDF and then submit it. Then you know you haven't gone over the word count. Look at the marks per question. They'll give you an indicator of how many words you should be using. So if you've got 3,000 overall in an assignment and one of the questions is 30 marks, you're going to know that that's a big percentage of your word count that you're going to use in answering that question. Quality and quantity of references as well is a key thing. Simon's kind of gone over. We use the Harvard referencing method, and there is a document that you can use to help guide you through the referencing part. Allow enough time for referencing. So don't take your research and your writing of your assignment right up to the wire, up to the day of submission, because it can take quite a bit of time to do. So I would say leave enough time. Don't rush your referencing. Don't leave an hour before submission and you've still got all your referencing to do. Allow enough time to do quality referencing. Synthesizing materials to demonstrate your understanding. So as Simon said, you know, you've got a quote in there. Talk about how that quote is relevant to answering the question and relevant to your organisation, and whether or not, you know, you agree with the person that has said this or not, and what evidence you have in whether you agree or not. So it's synthesizing answers and materials. It's answered the what and the why. The what is important, okay? So look at how everything relates. That links to the sort of synthesis answer, and make sure that you are answering the question and you are giving enough of your own voice that's coming through. And lastly, and this is really important, Simon's given some really good advice on how to avoid academic malpractice, and that could be plagiarism, collusion, or just a cap at a pass at poor academic malpractice. You know, if you're caught for plagiarism or collusion and the percentage of the work in your assignment or your open book exam is showing that it's not your own, it's say full of cutting and pasting and quotes and no synthesis, then you will find that you'll get a 1 mark, which shows that you failed due to academic malpractice. So you want to avoid that at all costs if you can. Okay, there's some useful links here. We've got the command word link. We've also put a link back to Carrie Foster's original session that she did, which was the guide to writing a great assignment, an OBE. And that's broken down into bite-sized chunks on YouTube. So if you wanted to just go back over her part on command words because you're still struggling with that, just click on the section for command words and watch that back. It's a really, really useful session. We've also got details around all of the ABE way and all of the principles that we're working towards. There's some great study tips and obviously the links to command words. On the website, on the student page, you will find links to all of this as well. And a lot of the documents are also featured on the portal as well. So you should be able to find all this stuff. If you can't, then contact your centre. Your centre should have all of this and have downloaded this anyway. Okay. And then lastly, we've just really got to the questions section. So I've answered one that was on Facebook that came through. I'm just going to check my other stream. There aren't any more there. Okay, so we've got a few more. How many references are we to do for level 6? Okay, so in terms of references, there aren't a set number. It's about the synthesis that Simon talked about. So if you're preparing your argument or answering a particular question, it's about the relevance of a reference. So a reference or a referring to a piece of text or a source is used to support your answer. So we would never say you need to, per answer, give 4, 5, or 6. It's just the relevance of those references for you to be able to answer the question. So there isn't really a guide on that. But if you kind of go back through the session that Carrie did last year, that we've put the link to, you'll be able to see examples of referencing and when it's relevant and how to put relevant referencing in, because there's a whole detailed section on that. So it isn't really about numbers, it's about the relevance of it. Then it says, can we use colour in our tables? You can use colour in tables, but what I would ask you to think about is that table relevant? Does that table need to be inserted as part of your answer? And is it just taking up space? So yeah, colours can be used, but it's, are they relevant, and are the tables relevant? So only include what's absolutely necessary to answer the question. Just going to go to the chat and have a look in the chat to see if there's any further questions. Okay, so one question is that some students received a 1 mark in their exam, under which okay, so that we've answered. A 1 mark means that academic malpractice is in place. Okay, so yeah, so if the student got a 1 mark, that means academic malpractice took place. So they didn't pass the plagiarism and collusion tests in Turnitin. Okay.
Vicky, can I just add that if anybody is uncertain about the 0 or 1 allocation marks, there is a marks explanation policy on the website. Mm-hmm. So if you look in the policies section of the website, the link to that is in the footer on the main page, the home page. You'll see a policy which outlines why the rationale for awarding particular marks.
Okay, and then we've got another question about how to reference a journal that's on a website. So I guess it's whether or not you access that journal and you reference that journal, then you would reference the journal, or whether or not it's a particular website. So in our referencing document, there's details of how to reference both. So I would just urge you again, like the command words document, to have the referencing document open so that it can show you how to reference in the assignment and then how to do the reference section at the end. Okay, I think that is all of the questions there at the end. You can still submit questions to us if you think of any after this session. They can either be via your centre, and then they can contact us if they collect all of the questions in. Your regional business director or business manager can also filter questions in. You can send questions in via that, and they'll filter their way through to product or the product email. So there's several ways that you can do it. If you've got any questions following this session, it has been recorded, so you can watch the session back, and the slides will be supplied as well, so you can see those useful links that are in there. And there, as I said, there's a lot more detail in Carrie Foster's full version of this webinar that we've acknowledged at the bottom there. She's one of our chief examiners. And there's much greater detail on command words referencing in those YouTube videos that should help you prepare for the up and coming session. I'm just checking, there's one more in the chat that's come up. No, I think they have all been they've all been answered. Okay. Oh, okay, hang on. There's another question coming through. Okay, about the 0 grade. Okay, so you would get a 0 mark if you didn't include an organisational summary. So if you're a new student and you've never done an assessment before, I would advise you to contact your tutor and have a conversation with your tutor before you start preparing. But when you look at an assignment or an open book exam, there'll be a front cover with a page of instructions. Read that really, really carefully. And for both open book exams and assignments, you need to pick an organisation and you need to do a summary of that organisation. And there's a space for that. And it's 200 words you need to complete. And there's guidance on the things you need to include in that organisational summary. If you fail to include an organisational summary, then your work doesn't get marked and you receive a 0 mark, so you fail. So the reason for the organisational summary is because when you answer the questions in the assignment or the open book exam, we want you to relate them to your organisation. So we need to know what your organisation is that you've chosen, so that we can see how you relate your answers to that organisation. And as I said, if you look at the questions, that might help guide you as to the size organisation you pick. We would encourage you to pick one in country so that you can access materials around that organisation. But sometimes you might want to pick a larger organisation depending on the questions that are asked, or you might want to pick a more medium-sized organisation. The key thing is that you can access information about that organisation in order to answer the questions. So hopefully that answers the 0 mark question that we've had. Okay. Well, we've just gone slightly over time, so I think that's us calling time on this webinar. We hope it's been really, really useful to you. And as we've said, you can follow up with questions via various routes after this session. I'd just like to thank everybody for turning up. We've had record numbers in the Zoom. We had at one point 100 people in the Zoom, and I'm sure we've had equal numbers watching us on our Facebook live stream. So thank you to everybody for attending, and good luck from all of us at ABE with the up and coming assessment window. We wish you every success, and we'll see you at some point in the future. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.